Well, hello, everybody. My name is Devin Redmond. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Theta Lake. I thought we'd go ahead and get started. First, I wanted to thank everyone for joining virtually and partaking in hopefully a good session where I give you some things to think about, and we can hopefully keep the conversation after this going. Feel free to stop by our virtual booth or follow up with us directly after. So what I wanted to talk about today is dealing with risk and compliance management in a remote work world, primarily using collaboration tools. So with that in mind, what I wanted to actually start with was an interesting little bit of snippet. I think Satya said it best. This is actually out of a presentation that we were being given by our Microsoft Teams developer partner group at Microsoft. This is basically, I think, encapsulates everything that we've experienced over the last little bit, add a couple months on top of it, right? But we've seen multiple years of digital transformation in just a few months. And what I think is very interesting about that is not the stats and not just those things that are true. It's forced us to rethink a lot of the tools and technology that we use to share information and to communicate. Another subtle point in here that I think is important for all the compliance folks on the call who may have been skeptical, reluctant, hoping that they could get away with not archiving, not capturing, not reviewing those types of electronic communications that happen inside of collaboration platforms, video conferencing. The thing I'll have you note here is this is actually a screenshot taken by my CTO and sent to me while he was live in the presentation. So not the recording party in the call, not the person hosting the meeting, the person who was participating in that was very quickly and easily able to just do a screen grab and capture that information. So it's not an elevator conversation, as they say. It's not the type of thing that you can pretend didn't happen because you did not record it. It's very easy for anybody who participates in that environment and in that information sharing session to capture and keep that information for themselves. So you cannot do yourself and your organization the disservice of pretending it didn't happen, because the other side can easily prove that it did and actually does have that information. So just a subtle point that's important to note while we think about the digital transformation that's happened in such a very short time. What I also think is interesting, this comes from the Goldman Sachs recent report on the state of work 4.0. And it talks about how COVID has impacted the technology environment and software markets in particular. What you'll see in this one is up there in the highest quadrant of most rapid adoption and the biggest tailwinds or the most momentum is really things like messaging and collaboration, video conferencing, all of those platforms that we have shifted to as key components of how we are not just communicating, right? It's not replacing a phone call. It's not just replacing an in-person meeting. It's how we actually share information. And what that means is even as we hopefully come back to some semblance of normality where there's a balance of seeing people in person and meeting in person, the benefits of using those tools and the reality of how you can share information with those tools is not something that's going to go away, right? It's the proverbial genie is not going to go back in the bottle because frankly, it's more effective and it's more useful. And you can see that reflected in purchase cycles and adoption cycles and usage of that. So it might seem convenient to say, hey, I'm going to push the conversation of how I operationalize those platforms out further or down the road. But the reality is they are here to stay. They're not going to go away. So now that your organizations most likely have gone through a wave of increased usage of Microsoft Teams or Cisco Webex or Slack or Zoom or any of the tools and capabilities that fall into that, maybe all-in-one UCaaS suites that include chat and video as well as voice and things like SMS. So UCaaS platforms like RingCentral that your organizations may have started to use. The reality is you need to think about those as being a permanent fixture and probably supplanting significant parts of your legacy information communication infrastructure. If not supplanting, definitely augmenting, definitely being part of the mix, assuming multiple hours per day of usage of each of those things where you can have a variety of challenges happen. If you think about that as the new reality of your technology environment, you also need to recognize that every time there's a comm shift and there's a a rapid adoption of a new communication infrastructure, there's a shift in the risks that you have to face. So whether you look at the massive growth in the numbers, and some of those are even more dated, if you look at the latest earnings of Zoom, or you look at other adoption counts from Microsoft, you'll see that the numbers have scaled dramatically beyond that. Even before the pandemic, even before COVID-19, the reality was collaboration tools and platforms, including video first technology, were on the rise to the extent that regulators were paying attention to it, right? So this is something that was on the agenda, or on the docket, as they say, where regulators were expecting firms and your organizations to spend more time doing proper supervision of that, and doing that in the modern regulatory supervision context, where you need to be more proactive, where you need to think about senior managers regime, you need to think about PRIPS, you need to think about Reg BI, all in that environment. And frankly, given that that environment set an all-time record in terms of communication monitoring fines in 2019, and already exceeded that in 2020, despite a little bit of easing or understanding from the regulators, the reality is that's inescapable. And if you have shifted to a new communication environment, you need to be paying attention to that. And now is the time to put plans in place and do that while there is more understanding and receptivity from that regulatory environment that, yes, you are in a massive migration to these new channels. So keep that in mind, but also note other risks tend to go along with that, right? You have more remote workers than ever. They are often not very well trained on the platforms that they are using in these environments. The bad guys tend to follow where the information goes is where the bad guys go. So you will have a variety of things that you now have to think about in an environment that is not in your traditional perimeter, with folks who aren't necessarily as comfortable using these platforms or as adept at using these platforms, who may not actually have the training. I don't know how many of you have adopted significant new training programs and training technologies to help people become more familiar with the collaboration tools that you've rolled out in a rush, but all of those tend to create risk. What I want to do next is actually walk you through what some of those look like. I think it's important to get context. It's great to talk about risks in the abstract. Some of the headlines you've read are funny. You may or may not have seen a coworker with stains on their shirt, food on their face, a loved one come in the background. Maybe they're not wearing pants, maybe they are. All of those things are kind of amusing. Maybe it can trigger some downstream liability. But the reality is that you need to be thinking about what happens in these environments, because this is the new workplace. This is the new arena that your employees are interacting with each other, as well as interacting with your customers, clients, partners. And you can start to run into behavior issues. You can start to run into security issues that are completely outside of your traditional security, traditional acceptable use technologies, things like web filtering and web controls in that environment. And I think it's important to note that when you think about collaboration environments, you need to think about the whole spread of technologies you use there, and the fact that they tend to be very intermeshed, right? You will often see people move from a chat into a full video conference by putting a link in there, or if your organization's more sophisticated, maybe you've already embedded, say, your Zoom app inside of your Slack implementation, or same thing with WebEx meetings and WebEx Teams. All of those things can be had at the click of a button. So you could have a chat where somebody starts to talk about something sensitive and then says, hey, let me jump over to the video, and shares a video link, and you jump onto the video with them and you're immediately in the video. Or maybe you just press the call button and it automatically calls them. So you need to be thinking about what happens in each of those platforms and think about the types of controls that you may want there. For example, you want to make sure people aren't sharing links to abusive, offensive, potential liability driving sites that can, at the very least, create bad conversation threads and bad sentiment in the organization, and at the most can trigger lawsuits and other issues in that environment. So what if there's a bad link inside of a chat? Or what if your workers are interacting with each other or with clients or with partners and they don't do the basics? For example, they actually leave things on a whiteboard in the background, like their network password and their network ID information, making it easy for somebody to compromise them and then steal their data, and in turn, steal your data by getting access to their personal network and being able to take advantage of that. Or perhaps this person's in an office and that's office information. So you need to think about all of those things that can be exchanged in that environment as potential exposure points that you need to deal with. Other examples are the robustness of the different things that you can do inside of these platforms, right? It's no longer okay to think about it as a single facet, right? It's not an email where you have text-based communication in the email that you can capture and then review at a later point in time. It is a rich, multimodal sharing environment. In that sharing environment, you can use the camera and show things on the camera and say different things in the audio that don't track. So if you were just using the audio recording and using transcription, and the person in this particular meeting on the left-hand side said, hey, I think you should really get into this IPO, it's a good one, or hey, I think this is a really good one, and they don't even mention the word IPO, they don't even mention anything else, they just say, I think this is a good one, and you're looking at the transcript, you have no context on it. But if you actually capture the video as well and can analyze those two things simultaneously, you can actually see that a prospectus was shared on screen or showed on the camera when the person actually said, hey, I think this is a good one. And so now you can be on top of the fact that there was a potential performance implication, misleading claim, promissory statement, all of those types of things that can get you into hot water, where if you don't have the full context of what is shared, shown, spoken, and typed all in one place, you are likely to miss that. Similarly, the tools give you a very rich way to share information inside of them, which you should embrace, but you need to recognize that it's not just the camera, it's not just the basics of the screen sharing, it's the fact that you have chat built into these platforms that you can use in meetings. It's the fact that you have whiteboarding workspaces that you can use, so you can actually type inside of that. So maybe you've disabled the chat, but you've left the whiteboard on. The whiteboard can serve as a place to capture information bidirectionally inside of that meeting and brainstorm, and now becomes a location where, for example, on the right-hand side, we're exchanging account numbers, and as quickly as I want to, I could go ahead and do a screen capture and have those account numbers exposed. It's also electronic communication, and now you're exchanging PII or information that would be protected under CCPA, GDPR, et cetera, in that environment. So you need to think about all the different vectors that are available for somebody to leverage in that environment. Very important. And then the last thing I'll mention is that even if you're just thinking about chat and you're thinking about it as traditional electronic communication, it is not an email. You cannot use email-based systems as your sole mechanism to capture and deal with that. You need to think about the fact that it is a rich media platform where you can share video, voice, emojis. It's an asynchronous timeline. It is not to and from, it is participants over that timeline. And you can share information, including files inside of that may have sensitive information. So you need to think about the fact that this is a full information sharing platform, collaboration tool, as the name implies, in that environment. And you need to be able to keep watch on that. And then the last thing I'll note is that even outside of the things that you may be thinking about when somebody uses the whiteboard, types in the chat, shows something on camera, shares their screen, and shares maybe Excel incorrectly, is the fact that you can share any web-based app too, right? In an environment where you've likely moved to more and more cloud-based applications that are hosting sensitive information, sharing outside of your entire perimeter from one web-based collaboration tool or communication infrastructure, data from other web-based collaboration portals that may be not in your private cloud environment are critical things to consider here. So for example, if I were on a tour internally, and that's a picture of me from a screenshot that I took while I was getting a tour from our bookkeeper, who was showing me new applications that we could use in our environment. New HR management platform, a new contact management and customer repository, and a new cap table stock management, all of which are full of PII, full of customer data, full of sensitive corporate information, if I were to allow them, and all of which could easily just be shared inside of the browser, inside of a screen share, inside of my meeting. So being able to detect and deal with all those things is going to be critical for your environment. So think about all of those different avenues and be thoughtful about what you're going to do with your employees. And then recognize that even before the pandemic and even before you use these tools, you were most likely struggling with scaling your supervision programs because the legacy technology you used to capture recordings, to capture emails, was not really designed for your modern requirements. Plus, the amount of data that you have amassed made it even harder to scale through that and do the types of proactive reviews you need to do for senior managers regime, for MiFID II, for FINRA, for CFTC requirements, for Reg BI, for PRIPS, et cetera, including everything that you need to do for data protection. You were already struggling with that. If you layer on these new collaboration channels, it becomes even more difficult. And it was already known pre-pandemic that a lot of the things in this environment were more time consuming to do the review on, right? So this is not even taking into consideration the time it would be requiring you to go out and do the follow-on remediation steps, the follow-on reporting actions. This is just the time to review video. So it can take up to 2.5 times the length of the video to do manual review, right? Watch it, take notes, do all of those types of things. So important to keep that in mind. And then think about the fact that you don't want this to be a cost burden. You're already going to have to invest in a new technology stack. You don't want to make compliance and risk management even that much more time consuming and resource intensive. You should be able to get efficiencies, which gets me to the advice. So first and foremost, I believe in collaboration tools. I think they are the things that have kept our businesses afloat in a time where we had to shift our entire operations. So trying to cripple them, turn off the features, disable whiteboards, not allow screen sharing is doing a disservice to your firm and your organization, and frankly creates a competitive advantage for the folks that are turning those things on. So you need to be using them. You need to embrace that because they are not going away, no matter how much you want to hide from them or hope that everybody's just going to go back to the office and we're going to use all of the old stuff that we have. It's time to recognize that painful reality, which is some of those things and some of the way we used to do business are not going to happen again. You're not going to return to them. So don't avoid collaboration tools and really embrace the features that they have. But as you do that, adopt new procedures and training. Make sure that you take the time to put training modules out there for staff to give them best practices and how to use those tools and how to conduct themselves when they're using those tools. As you do that, you should also adopt an entire new stack of technology. Maybe you are on the process to adopting some of the collaboration infrastructure, but now you need to build around that. Everything from deciding which platforms to use and making sure it's the right platform for your environment, all the way to adopting things like maybe new training technology, and then certainly new security and compliance technology that's designed to work with those tools hand in hand. Next thing I would say is definitely engage with the regulators. They're already looking at this. We're engaged with over 20 regulators across multiple geographies in the Americas, North America, Canada, in the UK, in Europe, in Australia, in Singapore. They're paying attention because they understand the way information is being exchanged is different, the way firms are communicating with clients is different, the way customer service is being done is different. And so they need to adapt as well and actually use the same types of technologies that you can use for supervision in that environment. So right now is the time where there's probably the most understanding in the regulatory environment and the most willingness or receptivity to collaboration on how to solve these modern challenges. Take advantage of it. Don't go dark and then hopefully or hope to yourself that maybe they will give you easing for many ongoing years, versus take this time to revamp, communicate with them what you're doing, get their thoughts, understand their perspective on this, and actually adopt that. I know it can be a little scary and daunting sometimes, but it's actually now is the right time to do that. Last thing I would say is when you think about the technologies you adopt and you think about that third bucket, try to leverage more AI to help human experts. I don't think AI replaces human experts, but with this new environment, with all of these new technologies, you need that opportunity to scale. And AI can help those humans do what they do best, which is apply human judgment to data that is surfaced to them. And I'll just give one last example. Hopefully you guys remember that screen where I showed the account number being shared, this is a view from within a system like ours that leverages AI to help reviewers move through that content more quickly. So the technology can actually identify things that are both spoken as well as shared, as well as typed in that environment. In this scenario, when it saw something on screen, it captured it and it took the reviewer right to that point in time, but it still allows the reviewer to interact with that, right? So the goal is to not replace humans and not supplant their judgment, but actually just help them navigate this ever-growing mass of content with things that may be interesting, and then put the full control of how they respond to that. Do they validate that as a valid risk in that environment? At their fingertips, and really help those humans do what they do best in this environment. So with that, I think we're right at time. Again, what I will say in this environment is whether you're using RingCentral Video, whether you're using Microsoft Teams, whether you're using Cisco Webex, whether you're using Zoom, or name the tool in that environment, the reality is collaboration tools are not the future. We were increasingly adopting them, but really the need to have safe and compliant collaboration is here. It's now the now. So with that in mind, you should be thinking about how you adopt the right technology, the right procedures, and the right security and compliance infrastructure to make that something your company, your firm, your organization can use as its competitive advantage as you move into hopefully what is a post-pandemic environment where we have a new balance of remote work and information sharing that allows us to all be more productive. With that, I thank you very much for making the time and spending the time with me online and being here at the virtual conference. If you have questions, feel free to stop by our virtual booth or contact us directly, and we're happy to respond. Thank you very much.